Hello everybody and welcome to JTV. Today we're going to be talking about Christian support for Israel, for the Jewish people, how this has developed, what should be the Jewish approach to this issue, and to dive into these issues because there's a variety of opinions on this matter and it's an ever-changing issue. And someone that's great to talk to about this because he very much lives in this world is Rabbi Daniel Friedman, who's joining us on Zoom from New Jersey. He also happens to be the former rabbi of one of my local community shuls in London, so know him pretty well. And now he founded the Center for Torah Values. And the purpose of this center is to strengthen American support for Israel based on America's biblical foundations. Now, we've actually covered this quite a lot on JTV. We've done videos about America's founding and how it was based, how many of the founders were inspired by the Bible, specifically the Hebrew Bible and the story of the Exodus. And also we've spoken about Christian support and for Israel. And this is something that's been a new development in Jewish history. And it's something that Rabbi Friedman thinks about a lot. He was just recently with Pastor John Hagee, who is one of the leading lights of Christian Zionism in America, and it would be great to delve into these issues. He's also been campaigning, and we'll talk about this, he's been campaigning for churches to adopt the IHRA, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which includes within it acknowledgement that demonization towards Israel and towards Israel's founding and existence should be considered a form of anti-Semitism, and therefore it's a very important definition, right? If you can't agree on definitions, then it's hard to say whether someone is or isn't anti-Semitic, and so we're going to talk about that. And he also does something which I'm really a fan of, and I think is such a necessary phenomenon in the Jewish world today, which is he has a book series and a daily podcast which talks about Talmud. Now, some people love Talmud and they love the nitty-gritty of it, but other people, and I guess I would be put in this camp, sometimes struggle a little bit with the legal intricacies and the sometimes what feels, I know it isn't, but it feels like it can be very trivial discussions, and he really tries to bring out the relevance, the depth, the wisdom within each page, within each Duff of Gemara, of the Talmud, and what a necessary thing that is. So we're going to talk about all those things, but the first thing to say is, Rabbi Friedman, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us.
Ollie, thank you so much for having me. Such an honor, privilege to be on JTV, and an honor and privilege to know you and your family for many years. Very great blessing in my life.
Well, the feeling is mutual. So we were speaking just last week when I saw you in person. You were telling me about your time with Pastor John Hagee, who, as I say, is a huge, perhaps the biggest Christian figure alive today that espouses support for Zionism based on Christian values. The first thing, before trying to understand what is the basis, the philosophical basis for their support of Israel and the Jewish people, I'd actually like to do it from the opposite end first and ask, what do you say to those who feel they're skeptical of the support of Christian, mainly evangelicals, support for Israel, because they feel, the criticism goes, and it is that their loyalty isn't so much to the Jewish people, the loyalty is to their beliefs and their theology, and that theology may go down different turns as as their lives develop, as their church develops, and therefore they question the sincerity of it. What do you say to that?
I think it's a great question, but I think it's a question that I would pose to you. I won't put you on the spot, but it's a question that I do pose to Jewish audiences anytime the question arises. And really my question is, why do you and you and you and you support Israel? And guaranteed I'm going to get a number of different answers, because even within our Jewish community, even within the Orthodox Jewish community, there is a spectrum of reasons. And to simply, the media likes to brushstroke and say, well, all evangelicals are dispensationalists, premillennialists, this is what they believe. And it's not so simple. It never is so simple. And I would say that the core reason, when people ask me, what is the common denominator, the core common denominator for which Christian Zionists are there for Israel, I would say it boils down to this. Let's say I'm a Christian pastor. I'm addressing my congregation on a Sunday morning. I say, parishioners, listen to this. Here I have the Bible. I'm holding up my Bible, and I want you to know it's true. Now, how can I prove it's true? Very difficult to prove that this book is truth. It's the Word of God. But here, let me give you a proof that is almost undeniable. See, one of the things that it says in this Bible is that God is going to exile the Jewish people from the land of Israel, and then eventually he's going to return them to the land of Israel. Now, against all odds, 2 millennia later, now this people shouldn't have even still be in existence. God then gathers them back just as he promised in this Bible. Now, my dear parishioners, I want you to know, if you can see this with your very eyes, that's a proof of the Bible. Now I want you to listen to the rest of the things that I have to offer from this Bible. Now that you know, that you've seen, you've witnessed the truth. So at its very core, the reason Christians support Israel is because it's a clear proof of the truth of the Bible.
Right. And so, you've done this was this topic for your PhD, right? You're actually a rabbi and doctor. And why don't you take us through then? Well, before we do the history, actually, what would you say then, based on what you just said, what fundamentally is motivating this Christian Zionism then? Is it just well, what specifically is it? I understand it's based in the Bible, but can you be more specific than that?
Yeah, so again, if I can, here is my proof of the veracity, the truth of the Bible, because I can show you something before your eyes that says that shows that the Bible demonstrates that the Bible is true. So that's one key reason. There are many different reasons. Again, it runs the gamut of those who believe that blessing Israel per the Genesis 1, 2, 3, or Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, that says that those who bless Israel, God says to Abraham, those who bless you, I shall bless. So blessing Israel and the Jewish people results in one's own blessing and good fortune. So there are other aspects that have to do with theology. But again, the core reason to support Israel is because it's a demonstration that the Bible is true. The Bible, the prophecies of yore that were recited, that were given over thousands of years ago, against all odds, we have now seen over the last century come to pass.
But just because you see the story of the Jews as proof of the Bible's validity, that doesn't necessarily equate with supporting Israel, right? Because there is this idea of replacement theology, that God replaces covenant with the Jews with Christians, and therefore they might say, yes, Jewish story points to divine providence, but why should that necessarily lead to any particular favor towards supporting the Jews?
Right. So it's really, in many ways, the best response to those who believe in replacement theology. Those who say that Christians or Christianity superseded Judaism and the Jewish people, it would make no sense for the Jewish people now to be in the state of Israel. In fact, it wasn't until the 90s that the Vatican, the Holy See, recognized the state of Israel because it was illogical. It made no sense that the Jews returned to Israel. The Jews were meant to be obsolete, or at the very best, it depends how we define best or worst, according to St. Augustine, they were still here in terms of witness doctrine, so that it witnessed the origins of Christianity and the New Testament that can only exist with the Old Testament. But the fact that the Jewish people that shouldn't exist anymore, or shouldn't be God's chosen covenant anymore, should be returned to Israel, that's the best proof that supersessionism, replacement theology, is wrong.
So most of these Christian Zionists, the evangelicals, they don't subscribe to replacement theology. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. And I would say even amongst non-Christian Zionists, replacement theology is a little taboo. Or you can have Christian Zionists who are not necessarily evangelical. I would say that probably the most the majority of Christian Zionists are evangelical, but Christian Zionists could come from a variety of places. There are those who are able to argue in favor of Christian Zionism, even straight out of the New Testament, without even going to the Old Testament proofs for it. So it's Christian Zionism as a broad term is bigger than one particular theological viewpoint. And even so, I traveled with Pastor Hagee, Christians United for Israel, and Christians United for Israel is a broad tent consisting of various theological positions, affiliations, but those who ascribe to replacement theology, thank God, are a proverbially dying breed.
So what do you find most of them believe? I know you don't want to generalize, but do they consider the Jewish people still to be God's chosen people?
So God's chosen people is, I would say yes, but that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Now, those who read the scripture that says that, that each covenant that God makes does not in any way supersede the previous covenant, say that what says in Paul says that Christians were grafted on to the Jewish people, meaning to say that the Jewish people were not denied God's covenant. In fact, many Christians, especially Christian Zionists, say that if God were to abrogate a covenant, if God were to say that his covenant with the Jewish people is no longer in existence, then where does that leave them or anyone? If God can break his covenant, then why begin a covenant with a God that changes his mind? So many Christian Zionists ascribe to the belief that God has multiple covenants. I'll give you an example of how Jews also ascribe to a similar idea. So following the great flood, God makes a covenant with Noah that he will never destroy the world. Now, later, God makes a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. Does God mean at that point to forget his covenant he made with Noah? Of course not. Right? There's a covenant that God makes with humankind, and then there's a more specialized covenant that he makes with Abraham. And so in a similar vein, Christians who ascribe to this approach of theology would say, no, God never stopped his covenant that he made with the Jewish people. He made a separate covenant with Christians. Now, depending on your theology, that will determine what the consequences are for the previous covenant. Simply to say that, well, God has one covenant with one person, one group, and a different covenant with a different group. We kind of say that. We believe that you can be a Noahide and you can be Jewish, and everyone can go to heaven based on what you're doing. Christians don't believe that. Some do, but that's known as dual covenant theology, and that's a little theologically problematic. But what they do believe is that the covenants play a role, and it's an ongoing role. Now, those roles may come into play later in a further stage of history, but right now God has covenants that are active, meaningful, and he wants Christians and Jews to work together for the good of Israel, the Jewish people, and the entire world.
Now you got to spend a lot of time with John Hagee. Was that on a trip to Israel?
Yes. Just now, 10 days in Israel, Pastor Hagee took a dozen or so rabbis and pastors uh, partnered together along with our spouses. The reason he put this trip together, see, when he first started honoring Israel, this goes back to the early 80s, he developed a relationship with his local rabbi, Rabbi Aryeh Sheinberg in San Antonio, Texas. And this relationship really flourished over the years. They worked together to build Christian and Jewish support for Israel, to open doors together. Sadly, Rabbi Sheinberg passed away about a year and a half ago. And Pastor Hagee said, well, where does the relationship go from here? And he decided that the relationship could be emulated across America. if there were pastors and rabbis who were spiritually bound to one another and dedicated to this mission and work together. And so Christians United for Israel has now paired up pastors and rabbis, and he brought this inaugural group on this trip with him to Israel with Pastor John and Diana Hagee. And so Batya and I had the privilege of joining. Well, my chavruta is Pastor Scott Thomas of Lakeland, Florida, who, together with his wife Cindy.
When you say chavruta, you mean you teach him?
So we learn Psalms, Tehillim together every fortnight, and the insights that we get from one another are just so powerful because we have different traditions, and we know that this is not a new idea. If you look into the classic Jewish commentator, the Abarbanel, he often quotes Christian exegetes, commentaries, and sometimes he will agree with them, and sometimes he will show why he disagrees with them. But this meeting of the minds is something that we have the honor of renewing in our generation.
And what do you think, if you had to narrow it down to one thing, what do you think is motivating someone like Pastor John Hagee?
He loves Israel. He loves the Jewish people. Following the Israeli bombing of the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq, Israel was being attacked from all sides. Terrible public relations moment for Israel. And Pastor Hagee visited Israel shortly after. He was davening, praying at the Western Wall. And he says, this makes no sense. Israel just did something that saved Western civilization. And here Israel's being beaten up on, and why is nobody standing up for Israel and for everything that we stand for? And he made up in his mind then that he's going to be there for the Jewish people. So he looks to his right and he sees a Jewish fellow, Hasidic fellow, praying at the Western Wall, and suddenly he's overpowered with this energy that he has to embrace him. It's like, well, wait a second, I didn't even know this fellow. I'm gonna look crazy if I suddenly embrace him. But he says to himself, you know what, when I get home, I am going to find Jews, the Jewish community, and get to know them personally and work with them. And I will tell you today that has flourished, with his relationship with Rabbi Scheinberg. And we also had on our trip in Israel Malcolm Hoenlein, who really has done incredible things for the safety and security of the Jewish people and the Jewish community in America, former executive vice president of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. He accompanied us throughout our trip, and it became very clear that the doors he has opened for Pastor Hagee over the years. I'll give you a couple of examples that we visited on our trip that really blew my mind. Anything that I thought that I knew of what Pastor Hagee and Christians United for Israel does, that I'd written about in my research, it took it to a whole new level. So we visited the Great Synagogue in Jerusalem, and next time you go there, you're going to see a wall that was unveiled on our visit, honoring Pastor Hagee. And it's the whole wall of their names in gold. And I'm holding up my hand larger than the screen permits, but their names are there in bold and gold, honoring. I mean, who would have ever thought that a Christian pastor in America would occupy a wall of the Great Synagogue in Jerusalem? But that's nothing. Wait a sec. So we then go to the Bells Shul, the Hasidic, the biggest, really actually the biggest shul in the world. It's a Hasidic synagogue in Jerusalem that seats 10,000. So it's massive, on 10 stories. And we have our tour with the Hasidic tour guide, who happens to be an Aussie like myself. And so, you expect that this Chassid is going to speak with a strong Yiddish or Hebrew accent. No, broad Aussie accent. So he's giving us the tour, and the tour culminates in, on the grounds of the Bell Shul, there is a medical clinic that has been donated by Pastor Hagee, and there's a plaque on the wall honoring Pastor Hagee. Who would have thought the Bell Synagogue has a plaque on the wall honoring a Christian pastor? But that's not it. Then we go to the Jewish Agency, and the Jewish Agency over the last year alone has brought in over 70,000 new immigrants from Russia and Ukraine. With the outbreak of the war, Pastor Hagee contacted and said, what can I do? Just in 1 year alone, he has donated $9.5 million to the Jewish Agency to assist with immigration efforts.
Wow, that is completely remarkable. Wow. I think he should be considered among the righteous among the nations. He's clearly done amazing stuff. Wow. We'd love to speak to him, by the way. I don't know if you'd be able to help set that up. We'd love to do an interview with him and have a conversation about some of the things he does.
Well, let's see what we can do.
Yeah, I think that'd be really interesting. I think more people in the Jewish world, certainly outside of America, it'd be great for them to become aware of his work. Amazing work. It's really great cause for optimism, I think. Before we shift to the IHRA stuff, you did a PhD in Christian relationship with Israel and Jewish people. How and when and where did this movement really start to develop?
Yeah, so it begins. Christianity begins as a sect of Judaism that doesn't take off, a messianic sect that doesn't take off with mainstream Judaism, and eventually, Christianity and Judaism go their separate ways, and it manages to take it to a whole new level when Emperor Constantine takes Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. But I mentioned earlier witness doctrine and the fact that the Jews are still around, and yet we have this supersessionism where Christianity is meant to have replaced Judaism. So what's the purpose of the Jews that are still here? And St. Augustine says, well, we can persecute them as long as they are here. During the Middle Ages, that comes to terrible extremes, claims of deicide, and we go through the Crusades, the Inquisition, until 1517. Martin Luther pins his 95 Theses on the door of the Church of Wittenberg, and thus begins the Reformation. Now, essentially, the key term that we need to be familiar with here is sola scriptura, which means solely, only Scripture. Now, Luther says that the Church Fathers, Catholicism, has corrupted the Bible. So instead of adhering to the Bible as it is written, people read the Bible and understand the Bible the way certain theologians have told them to understand it, but that's not God's word. And so the Reformation, or the beginning of Protestantism, is a return to the word as its most basic meaning and interpretation. Now, Luther himself and his disciple Calvin still remain very anti-Semitic, because you can't, things that are ingrained, it's very hard to remove them. But slowly but surely, you have theologians such as Thomas Bezer and others who say, wait a sec, well, if we're reading the Bible as it's written, you can't say that every time it says Israel or Zion, it refers to Christians. No, we have to believe that that refers still to Jews and the Jewish people. And what comes from there is a movement that becomes known as, and this word has multiple meanings, but in this context, restorationism means the restoring of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland, to Israel, as the Bible promises will happen. Now, the beginnings of that movement really take off in the British Isles, but then when Christians come to the new land, to America, it becomes a very powerful movement. Why? Because many Christians see their journey as paralleling the journey of the ancient Israelites. They escape religious persecution in Europe the same way that the Jewish people escaped Pharaoh and had the Exodus. They then cross the Atlantic the same way that we cross the wilderness. They then arrive in the promised land. Sometimes some of them refer to it as the new Israel or the new Jerusalem. and they still have to conquer the frontier and make this, own this new promised land that they have. And so there becomes this strong feeling of restorationism that develops over a number of centuries. So what happens in America is that you have this affinity for the Bible story, and this affinity for, if we are connected to ancient Israel by our movement to America, then we need to support the vision of the Bible of the Jewish return to Israel. Now, that becomes even stronger in the 19th century for a number of reasons in America, having to do with the Civil War and ideas, theological ideas, called premillennialism versus postmillennialism. Will the final days happen, or do we need to work towards them? Do our efforts make a difference? And then a theology that comes actually from Ireland, but doesn't really take off in Britain and Ireland, by one John Nelson Darby, who travels to America, where his ideas begin to really take root. And because of a few influential figures, evangelists who are able to get the word out and teach many students, this idea of a Jewish return to Israel becomes part and parcel of many Christian thinkers in America. And I mean, we see it on both sides of the pond. Christian Zionism is responsible for the likes of Lord Balfour. Christian Zionism is responsible for Pastor Heckler, who walks into Herzl, and when everything seems like all the doors are shut, the Jews are not listening to him, he says, "No worries, I will take you in to see the Kaiser." He begins to open those doors for him. And then Christian Zionism, on this side of the pond, we see when President Truman decides that he's going to lobby other countries. I mean, we think that the UN petition plan of 47 was a fait accompli. It just happened. No, there was a lot of lobbying that happened. And President Truman would go on later in his life to declare, "I am Cyrus, I am Cyrus, I am the man responsible for the establishment of the state of Israel." And it's all of these ideas as they unfold that, you know, what we see today in the form of Pastor Hagee and others is the development of centuries of thinking that point in this direction.
And what do you think is motivating some churches which are actually quite vocally anti-Israel? Do you think it's just they're just still on the old train? You know, they haven't caught the new one yet.
Yeah, so that was actually the basis of my doctoral research. You know, I did my master's looking at evangelicals, and then the more I found myself researching, the more I began to see that, well, wait a second, this is not homogeneous. The charge against Israel, the BDS movement, is actually also coming from American churches. What is going on? And so in my doctorate, I actually track the parallel journeys of what is essentially a Scots-Irish tradition that diverges in America. But what happened, and in the last couple of decades, that really brought it to a head, something actually has nothing to do with Israel whatsoever. In some of the mainline Protestant churches, you had historical relationships with the community, the Arab community, prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. You had missionaries who were there establishing hospitals, establishing universities. So there were strong ties there. So within those mainline denominations, you have strong bonds. At the same time, you have Christians that read the Bible and say the Bible is the homeland of the Jews. And so for the majority of the 20th century, there was this balance. So anytime there was a discussion about Israel and Palestine, it was voted on. There were resolutions. Some went in favor of Israel, some went in favor of the Palestinians. But the balance was more or less kept, because there were both factions. What happened in the early 2000s, again, as I say, nothing to do with Israel other than the way divine history plays out, is that a number of mainline denominations voted in favor of gay ordination and the permissibility of presiding over gay marriage. When that happened, the conservative element of many of these churches exited en masse, and they became independent congregations or started new denominations. At that point, those who were considered themselves moderate or in the middle suddenly found themselves having to hold the fort against progressives who were trying to push through a number of initiatives, including Israel. Israel's not the only issue, but suddenly the progressives now had the upper hand in a major way to be able to move through their resolutions, including supporting the BDS movement.
Right, right. And why have you made it such an important priority to get churches to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which has been adopted by many Western organizations and governments? Why is that so important?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head there where you said it's been adopted by many Western organizations and governments. The problem is when something happens at a 10,000 foot level, the average person on the ground is not even familiar with the IHRA organization or the definition or what anti-Semitism means if they saw it, right in front of their eyes. It's important, I feel, to take this to a grassroots level. So even Christians United for Israel has been involved, its lobbying arm, its advocacy arm, its C4, as it's called here, has been involved in having state legislations adopt the IHRA definition. I think there are up to about 35 states in America that QFI has been actively involved in having them adopt the legislation. Problem is, though, that doesn't translate down to the congregational level or the individual level. And so what I'm doing is working with one church after another, and hopefully with some major organizations such as QFI to be able to have them do it as a campaign for all their churches to sign on to, that on a church level, we're now educating the churches and individual Christians as to this major and unfortunately rearing its ugly head again issue of anti-Semitism. Now, on top of that, and returning to the mainline Protestant churches that have voted in favor of BDS, one of my goals on a denominational level is to be able to turn the tables. Right now, we have BDS campaigners who are putting forth these resolutions, these anti-Israel resolutions, and you have this small cadre of good people who are doing their very best to defend their churches. They feel that their churches have been co-opted and have this terrible name that all they want to do is be able to spread Christianity, and yet they're burdened with this agenda. And so they're on the defense every time something comes up they're trying to defend. Now imagine if we turn the tables and they were to present a resolution saying, we would like our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, to sign on to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now all of a sudden the anti-Semites have to now be on the defense and demonstrate to the church membership as to why we don't want to be a non-anti-Semitic church. And so it moves the dynamic around, and it's a very powerful tool. And there's no reason why those who are really just defending righteousness and a middle ground have to feel like they're the ones who are being pushed into a corner.
Absolutely. Well, I wish you a lot of success with that. It's a really important cause. The last thing to speak about is your Transformative Daf project, which is a book series, also a podcast. Can you just give us the elevator pitch for what it's all about and why people may enjoy reading it?
Well, Ollie, like you mentioned earlier, too many people feel disenchanted with Talmud study. My aim is to take something from every page of the Talmud and make it relevant, meaningful, inspirational to your life. And I will tell you, it's aimed primarily at the Jewish community, but my kids sometimes ask me, they say, Abba, why on your TikTok videos, and I've got thousands of TikTok followers, why do you get these amens and these hand praying emojis. I says, well, I have to tell you, not all the followers are Jewish. In fact, I would probably say the vast majority of my social media following is Christian. And we have a message, a Torah message that speaks to the entire world. We are enjoined with giving God's message to the entire world. Yes, it's not the commandments that we are asking everybody to keep, but to know godliness and biblical values and Talmudic values. That's our mission to the world, to be able to spread God's light.
Absolutely, and the time is right for that. Rabbi Friedman, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing with us so much of the insights that you have about this world of Christian support for Israel, as well as your other work with IHRA and the Duff project. We'll put some links in the video description. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us, and wish you huge success with everything you pursue.
As they say in these circles, amen, and thank you, Ollie, for having me.
Thank you.